Hi, this is Jen with Iowa Backyard Farmer, and today we're making jam. You usually see me in the garden, but once the garden is growing and the fresh produce starts coming in, I spend a lot of my summer preserving the harvest. We freeze, dehydrate, can, freeze dry, all sorts of things. It's saved us a lot of money over the years, and we eat really well because we grow things that you can't find in the store. The recipe we're using today is an easy one with just a few ingredients, and it also is going to give us a chance to talk about the basics of canning that apply to many recipes. So let's get started. This is Jam 101 with blueberry currant jam. Let's start with the fruit. Any canning project you do, you want to start with really good fruit and peak freshness. We don't want anything moldy or diseased or mushy or overripe. We don't want to can things that have been sitting around for a week while we've waited for a harvest to come in. Things like apples and pears and things have a shelf life. Things like cucumbers, not so much. Berries are kind of interesting because you want to pick some of them at least on the not quite ripe side. They have natural pectins in fruit that occur in higher amounts in slightly unripe fruit. So if you've made jam and it didn't quite set for you and you were using really ripe fruit, that might have been a reason. So when you're cooking jams, particularly berry jams, pick a little portion of your fruit that's slightly underripe and you'll get a better fruit set. Once you've got it, we're going to take it inside and we're going to wash it out. We took all the little stems off. I'm looking here for stems, leaves, bad berries that I may have missed, bugs that hitchhiked into side in my bowl. I just want to make sure it's all cleaned up. If you're asking, do I really have to take all the stems off these teeny tiny berries? The answer is no, you do not. If I was juicing these, I wouldn't even worry about it. A lot of the berries that I picked today were going to go into things like breads or other things, and I didn't want loose stems floating around, and so I just picked them all out. We're going to be making a seedless jam today, which includes the pulp, and I didn't want to have to strain them all back out later. So I just picked them out, and you can see me here picking through, throwing away little bad bits. You don't want to soak berries. If I was canning cucumbers, I'd pick them in the morning, I'd bring them in, I'd soak them in cold water. It helps them to stay crispy. If you take that same approach with your berries and you bring them in and you soak them because you want them to be extra clean, they'll get mushy and watery and they won't taste as good. After they're rinsed and you've picked out all the things you want to pick out, you can put them on a parchment lined pan about 1 layer deep. 1 layer deep because I don't want them to fuse into one big block that I can't get apart, and on a parchment or other lining on the bottom so that I can get them back off that pan when they're slightly damp. They'll just weld themselves to that pan and they're hard to get off. 1 layer deep also allows you to go through one more time, look for bugs, look for sticks, look for anything you need. I'm going to wrap that in some plastic wrap and put it in the freezer. It took me about 3 hours to pick all the berries, and they're not all pictured here, in one day. And this is a nice thing to know about jam, is that if you want to split this up, this is a really good time to split this recipe. I've done all my picking, processing, put them in the freezer. I'm tired. Now I can wait and come back and do jam another day. It's also really handy for smaller crops like my blueberries where I didn't get enough for the recipe all at the same time. And so I can do 1 or 2 pickings, freeze it in between, and then I can pick the day that I want to make jam, that I have time, because you're going to want to have enough time to do the rest of the cooking all in one spot. There isn't a really good breaking spot once you've started to cook. So if I was going to break this up, I'd say let's pick it one day, freeze it, and then pick a day where you're not going to be going in and out of the house to finish the rest of the process. So this was a long process. You've been seeing it now, but we're about ready to go. Now that I'm ready to start canning, we're going to put our jars, and you want to use designated canning jars. They're thicker. They have thicker rims. The seal on the lid that you use, you'll get a better seal on that nice thick rim. I like the Ball brand. That's been a really good quality thing, but the principle to look for is that you want a nice thick rim. You want it to be smooth on the top. You see me checking. I'm looking for nicks or dings anything that's not smooth on that rim that might prevent it getting a good seal. The kids use the jars. I've used some of them for decades. I just want to make sure that they're in good condition, because after you've gone to all the trouble to grow and process all the fruit you're going to use, it feels like a tragedy when it breaks in your canner and all that food is wasted. So just do a little double check, make sure everything is in good condition, make sure it's going to get clean, and we're going to run these through and get out our fruit. So here's that fruit that we froze earlier. These are the currants. The recipe calls for 2 cups of frozen currants and 1 cup of water and 4 cups of blueberries and a cup of water. And the reason they're in different pans is because they have slightly different cooking times. When you're cooking with jam, you really don't want to overcook it. The fresh fruit flavors will disappear if you cook it forever. So I know it would be tempting to be like, oh, I'll just throw it all in the same pan. I'm cooking the blueberries half as long, and they'll taste better for not being quite so cooked. You can see they come off that pan pretty well. And we're going to measure pretty exactly. I get in a lot of trouble with cooking, and I got in trouble even today. Somebody asked me for a recipe for something, and I said I don't have one because I eyeball everything. But with canning, and in particular jam, you want to be a little bit more exact. The set of this jam is going to depend on the sugar and the fruit and the ratios of those and how much pectin, and somebody has already gone through and figured that out. I have made jams before where I was a little less exact, and sometimes I cooked them too long and they were not as delicious when I was trying to make something that, all natural without pectin. This one is also without pectin, but the currants are very high in pectin and it'll work out just fine. But when I've gone off script and tried to make my own, I have a higher failure rate, which is to be expected. And I can also see you saying, if this is such a good recipe, why don't we double or triple or even quadruple it? It doesn't work that well with jam. If you put twice or 3 times the amount of fruit in each of these pans, it takes a longer time to cook, and that can mess with your recipe. The set of jam depends on a lot of different things, and bringing things up to a boil, and with sugar, it's just easier to do a small batch and do repeated batches than it is to do a great big batch. Jam tends to bubble up, and you don't have to use a great big pan. So in this case, we're gonna follow the recipe, and whenever I've followed the recipe, it's worked. It's amazing. If you haven't tasted a black currant, they are not my most delicious right off the bush. I like the red and pink ones better for just fresh eating, and so I froze a whole bunch of those, and we'll use those in top of cereal or in rolls or other things. The black currants have a really earthy flavor. It's a little more complicated, but it goes really well with the blueberries. The blueberries are a little bit sweeter, and so the combination of these two, I think, will be very good. They'll balance each other out. Straight black currant jam is very delicious, but some people consider it an acquired taste because it is a little it's a little different. It's a little darker than what you would expect in a straight berry jam. The red and pink ones have just like a kind of really clean, sweet and sour tart flavor. The black currants have that little earthy, almost woody undertone. It's kind of cool. But now that we've got them in the water and in the pans, and we've got the heat on, and we're just going to slowly simmer these for about 5 minutes. I've speeded it up for your convenience. What we're looking to do here is just soften the fruit. We're going to strain it and pull out the seeds or any leftover stems or anything. We'll run even the blueberries through the food mill. You'll see that not to get rid of any seeds because the seeds are small, but the food mill kind of gives you a really fine texture, so it'll be more consistent. You won't get big globs of blueberries in one bite and all juice in another. So I'll show you both ways, but this is the food mill, and it's pretty easy. In fact, I was making this project, and the minute I pulled out the food mill, one of my daughters came over and said, I can do that part. It's a real fun thing, and it just goes through. It has this little piece that just kind of pushes the blueberries against the screen as it goes around, and all the juice comes out and all the pulp comes out, but it'll leave a little bit of the skins, the tougher skins, and any big chunks behind. And what you get is a really nice, consistent, pretty fine texture, but you're still getting all that pulp, so it's not a jelly. It's not going to be quite as bouncy. You can see it's almost all the way done there too, and it works really well. So that you can see the difference, I'm going to do the currants another way, which is in a strainer, and you can just use a fine mesh strainer if that's what you've got. You can see they're nice and juicy. Freezing actually helps the cell walls break down when they thaw, and it is way easier to juice berries if they've been frozen first. So even if you thought, oh, I could do this all in one day, it's actually easier to freeze and then juice the berries a second day. This takes a little bit longer than the food mill, but it's just as effective. You get a nice smooth pulp. All those seeds, all the little bits, we're not going to keep them around. We've got all the deliciousness in the pan. Once you've got both of those strained, we can combine them. If I was doing a regular jam recipe, like with a store-bought pectin, what you usually do here is you're going to bring your fruit up to a nice warm temperature, and then you're going to add your sugar and your pectin. We're going to not add pectin because, like I said, the currants are very high in pectin, and we'll have to cook it a little bit longer because we are not using a commercial product, but it'll taste great. So the next step here is to bring it up to, I don't know, it's not really a whole boil, but we're going to cook it for about 5 minutes, bring it back up to temperature, and then we're going to add the sugar, and then we'll cook it for about 20 minutes. So we just give that a nice stir, let it be all combined, and then we're going to get out our bowl and measure the sugar. We want the sugar to be measured pretty exactly. That ratio, I told you before, jam is very dependent on sugar for the texture, but if you add too much sugar, there won't be enough fruit or fruit juice for all the sugar crystals to dissolve, and you'll end up with crystallized jam, and gritty, grainy jam is not delicious. And so you don't want to add too much. You may be thinking, well, I will add way less, and that will solve all my problems too. I like low sugar options. There are some options where you can replace some of the sugar with honey or corn syrup. You do need to be a little careful of honey. It tends to overpower the flavors of fruit, and so you don't usually replace all of the sugar with honey. Corn syrup is nice because it interrupts the crystallizing tendency of sugar to recrystallize, and it interrupts that, but you, again, find a recipe that uses part corn syrup. And you're like, well, I don't like either of those things. I'll just use a sugar substitute. I'll tell you to be careful. Aspartame is not heat stable, and it doesn't stay sweet. Saccharin can turn bitter. Sucralose you can use, but it doesn't protect the texture or the color of fruit the way sugar does. And so they don't last as long. If you have less sugar in your jam, you leave more water for molds and bacteria to work with. It doesn't protect the color. It will start to lose its color earlier. And so, jam you don't eat very much at a time. I'm going to just say, go for it and put in the real sugar and get the best product you can. We don't want those sugar crystals on the side of the pan either. If you leave little sugar crystals in your jam, it acts as a seed, and it might recrystallize your jam while it's sitting. So I'm brushing down the sides of the pan to make sure there's no sugar crystals. While it's cooking, this is 20 minutes, I'm going to heat up my canner with some hot water to sterilize my jars. Technically, if you're cooking any recipe for more than 10 minutes, there's enough processing time to kill any microorganisms that are going to cause spoilage, and you don't need to sterilize your jars. A hot water dishwasher wash is fine. You just need clean hot jars. Because I'm at an altitude of less than 1,000 feet, I can actually process this jam in a 5-minute time, but in order to do that, I'm going to need to have sterilized jars, which I can do in this nice clean canner with nice clean water. I'm just going to bring it up to a boil and put my jars in it later, and then I'll use that water to process the jam when I'm done. I switched sides here because we're getting close. The jam is, you can see how the boiling has changed. It's been close to 20 minutes. It's starting to thicken. It might foam up when you're cooking jam. This one really didn't. And you can scrape that foam off. It's mostly cosmetic. It's not going to hurt anything, but you could. So we've got that hot water up to a boil, and now we're going to put my jars in to sterilize them. Like I said, this step is not needed. If your altitude is less than 1,000 and you want to cook for 5 minutes, you need to do it. But if your altitude is over 1,000 and you're already cooking for 10 minutes, a nice clean hot jar is good enough. And here is our jam. It is ready to go into the jars. And so it's nice and hot. My jars are nice and hot. And the water in my canner, I don't want it to stay at boiling. It's turned off. I want it to come back down to 180 degrees about. But it is ready to go. So I'm just doing final assembly of the things that I need to put these jars together. I'm going to wash my lids. I'm going to use new lids, canning lids. You can get reusable varieties, but the ones that I'm going to show you today are designed and only guaranteed to be used once. You used to have to heat them up. They used to have a sealing compound made out of latex, but they use a plastisol now, and all you need to do is wash them and make sure they're clean. You can see I'm using new lids. I'll show you this old lid. You can see the indentation that was made by last year's lid. A lot of people say, oh, just reuse them. But again, after I've gone through all the trouble to grow and make this perfect jam, I don't want to risk a bad seal with an old lid, so I'm not going to use it. I'm now looking for the bands that go around. These are 2-part lids. You put the lid on and then you're going to screw the band on. You can reuse the bands as many times as they're good. So what you're looking for when you're looking for the canning rings is that you want them to not have rust on them. You don't want them to be bent out of shape or dinged or dented in some way, because you want them to fit nicely over the jar and hold it in place evenly so you get a good seal. And you see those are good. We checked those out. This one, looks like somebody stepped on it. That one gets to be done. It's lived its life. So we've got our jar, we've got our funnel, we've got our little tool that's going to show us how much headspace we need, and we're ready to fill our jars. Here we go. I'm going to move the pan close to the jar just so we're not getting drips, and you want to fill it up. Jam, this recipe calls for a 1/4 inch headspace. Headspace is really important when you're canning, and you want to get it right. Not all recipes are the same. Some things call for about 1 inch of headspace. This one's on the other end, and it just needs a 1/4 inch. If you leave too much headspace, you might not get a good seal. You'll have too much air left in your jar. But some things expand when you're cooking, and if you don't leave enough headspace, like apple pie filling notably, if you don't leave enough headspace, it will overflow the jar when it's in cooking because it expands, and all that food will get under the seal and your jars won't seal very well. So make sure you have the right headspace. Got a damp paper towel so I can wipe that ring off, and my little debubbler tool that can show me whether or not I've got enough jam in my jar. So I'm going to measure, and I came up a little bit short, so I'm going to add just a little bit more. There we go. And then I'm going to take that paper towel and a new jar to put my funnel down in so it doesn't get everything sticky, and wipe the rim of the jar. We want it to be smooth so that there's nothing to prevent a seal. Put your lid on, and then we're going to tighten that band until it's just fingertip tight. You don't want to use all your grip strength and tighten it all the way down, because then the hot air can't escape while it's canning, and it will bend and buckle instead of sealing. If you're like, well, I don't want to put it on too tight, you'll have the opposite problem, and you won't have enough pressure to get the the vacuum seal that you need, and it won't seal. So fingertip tight. I usually can figure that out by tightening it to where it catches and it's holding, but not so much where I'm like, oh, now we crank it down, right? And don't crank it down. I add that little bit more to the next jar, and we're going to wipe the rim. When you're canning, they tell you to not fill up all the jars on your counter and then put it into your canner. And there's a couple good reasons for that. One, you're trying to keep the temperature up. Your recipes are calibrated for a food that's a certain temperature, and if you just put all your jars out and fill them all up, they'll get cooler than you want. And the other reason, I'll tell you a story, is one year I was making spaghetti sauce or something with tomatoes, and I'd filled up several jars on my counter, and I was getting ready to fill up another one, but I was moving the jar, and it clipped something at the wrong angle, and it broke the top of another jar, and I had glass splatter everywhere, and it went into all those open jars, which I had to throw away because I didn't know which ones had glass in them. So it's a good idea just to, they're safe when they have a lid on them and a ring on them and they're in the canner and nothing else can happen to them. Fingertip tight, and they're ready to go. This recipe made about 4 half pints, which isn't a lot, but it was really good for this demonstration. You can see I'm still filling up the jar, and while I want to get every little bit of jam that's in here, I don't want to really scrape on the sides of this pan because, again, there might be undissolved sugar crystals, and I don't want any undissolved sugar crystals going into my jam. And so I might scrape the pan later and have it with toast, and it'll be totally delicious. Everybody likes a fresh taste of hot jam, but I don't usually scrape the pan to get every last little bit. The canning recipes are not always exactly the right amount that they say in the recipe. It'll say about 4 pints, and in this case I got 4 pints plus a little extra, and that little extra, I'm not going to can it because we don't have the right headspace. I'm just going to put it in a jar and put it in the fridge, and that'll be the one that we eat first. It'll be really good for tastes. So this is a hot pack recipe, which means that the food is going hot into hot jars, and we're going to put it in a hot canner. And those 3 things are really important. If I put cold jars in hot water, the change in temperature might create a thermal shock and I might break my jars. If I put hot jars into cold water, it's the same idea. And if you just start with cold canning water, one, it's going to take forever to reach a boil, and I might risk overcooking my food, and it isn't going to work right. So we want hot jars, hot water in the canner, and not have a thermal shock. In addition to that, you see we've got these 4 little lonely jars in my canner. We don't want these jars to fall over and while the water is boiling and risk messing up that seal again. So you see me here, I'm just going to sink a couple more jars just filled with hot water in there. They're kind of going to act as placeholders so that when that action of boiling is working with the jars, that there's something to keep them all standing straight up. I want them to not be touching the sides, and I don't want them to bounce into each other. All of that can cause damage. But once we've got them arranged and enough in there to keep everything upright, we're going to put the lid on and they'll be ready to go. You see me check right there. We want to make sure that the water covers those jars by about 1 inch so that everything is fully submerged under the water. That's how you get your even heat distribution in the canning process. And one last check. I was using my pressure canner. I want to remove that pressure plug so that it can vent. And then, since this is my first canning event of the year, I have to remember which way the lid goes on, and it's not that way, so I'm going to turn it around, and it should slide into place just like that. And the heat goes on, and we'll bring this up to a boil. You don't get to start counting your processing time until the water is at a boil, and you need to check to make sure that it's at a full boil. So here we go. This water is boiling. We can start our timer. Needs to stay at a boil for the entire time that is listed. Jam's not a problem. It's 5 minutes. But if you were doing something like tomatoes, it takes 45 minutes, and you notice your water was low and you had to add more hot water, and you'd have to start your time over if it went below a boil. But we're going to let this boil now for 5 minutes. Once you've processed your jam for the amount of time required by your altitude, let it sit for 5 minutes. Don't just take them immediately out. That can cause siphoning. Siphoning is when that rapid change in air pressure due to a rapid temperature change sucks all the liquid out of your jar. It's not a critical deal on jam. It's not I don't have a lot of problems with siphoning, but other things I do have, and if you'll just let it set for a few minutes, and you'll have way less siphoning. And then when you're done waiting, you can lift them out of your jar out of the canner with your jar lifter, straight up and out. We're not tipping them. That sealing compound is still soft and flexible, and we don't want to mess with that seal. They're really hot, so we're not checking on, we're not tightening the bands, we're not messing with anything. We're just going to let them sit here until they're completely cool, about 12 to 24 hours. Okay, so here they are, the results of all that hard work. Fresh out of the canner, you can see that they're still piping hot. We can look at the jars, but we're not going to mess with them, not until they've completely cooled. So we'll come back tomorrow. Here we are on the next morning, and they look great. I'm going to touch the center of each one and see if it pops or bends or flexes. If it does, it's not sealed. But these are all sealed really good. So I'm going to take off the rings. We're going to check that seal, and we're going to get them washed and labeled and ready to go. You don't want to leave those rings on because they can hold bacteria and other things, and it can give you a false sense of security. You might think it's sealed and it's really just holding the ring on, or the lid on. So we take the rings off, wash everything up, get it all clean. We'll wash the rings and put them away so that they don't get rusty, and we can use them another time. And we'll get this jar dried off and then labeled, and they'll be ready to go into the storage room. There we are, blueberry black currant jam. Perfect. Thanks for watching. Canning can be a great way to preserve your fresh garden produce in a shelf-stable way. It's fun and easy to do as long as you follow the guidelines and use tested recipes. You'll end up with great results every time. Good luck as you begin your adventure, and talk to you later. Bye.